My name is Emily Carter. I'm 30 years old now, but when this story began, I was 26, broke, exhausted, and trying to rebuild a life that seemed to fall apart every few months. I lived in a small apartment in Portland, Oregon, working as a junior graphic designer at a marketing agency that paid just enough to cover rent and instant noodles. I wasn't unhappy exactly, just invisible. The kind of person you pass in the grocery store and forget 2 seconds later. My mom used to say, "Emily, you're a slow bloomer. The world's too loud right now, but your time will come." She died of breast cancer when I was 24. After that, I stopped believing my time would ever come. My Aunt Linda, my mom's older sister, didn't help with that. Linda was the kind of woman who lived for appearances, crisp hair, designer handbags, and a voice that always seemed to carry judgment, even when she was saying something nice. She ran a small event service business, weddings, corporate dinners, fancy charity events, and she was good at it. Everyone in the family admired her for her success. Everyone except my mom, who once whispered to me after a tense Thanksgiving dinner, "Your aunt measures self-worth in money, honey." Never forget, the heart doesn't show up on a bank statement. After Mom passed, Linda became the loudest voice in family gatherings, and she never missed a chance to remind me how different I was from her daughter, Sabrina. Sabrina was everything Linda ever wanted to be at that age. Tall, blonde, Ivy League educated, and already engaged to a lawyer before she turned 25. I was the awkward one. The girl who showed up to family barbecues with paint on her jeans and thrift store shoes. It was at one of those gatherings that Linda said the words that would carve themselves into my memory. It was a Sunday in June. The sun was setting, kids were running across the backyard, and I was carrying a tray of lemonade glasses because I liked helping out. Linda stood by the patio, sipping her wine. Her eyes followed me, from my scuffed sneakers to the little ink stain on my wrist. "Emily," she said suddenly, her tone syrupy but sharp. "Do you ever plan on, settling down? Finding someone?" I laughed lightly, not realizing it was a setup. "I mean, I'd like to someday, but I'm not rushing."
She smiled, tight-lipped.
"Well, don't wait too long. Men with potential don't usually go for girls who are still figuring themselves out." I blinked, unsure if I heard right. "Excuse me?" Linda swirled her wine, eyes glinting. "I'm just saying, people tend to marry within their level. And you've always been a bit of a dreamer. You can't build a future on dreams, sweetheart." The words hit like a punch I wasn't prepared for. I felt my cheeks burn, but I forced a polite smile and said nothing. Later that night, I cried in my car before driving home. Not because her words were true, but because a part of me feared they might be. The months that followed weren't easy. My job was demanding, and my self-esteem was crumbling under the weight of invisible comparisons. Every time I opened Instagram, there was Sabrina posting another engagement photo or a luxury vacation. And every time I saw her smiling face, I heard Linda's voice whisper in my head, "Marry within your level." But life has a funny way of surprising you when you've completely stopped expecting anything. One Friday evening, I was working late at the office, designing a last-minute presentation for a real estate client. Around 8 p.m., the client himself, Daniel Hayes, a tall man in his early 30s with the kind of confidence that made you straighten your posture, walked in. He'd come to check on the progress, but instead of being impatient or dismissive like most clients, he pulled up a chair beside me. "You've been here all day?" he asked. "Pretty much," I said, brushing hair from my face. The presentation needed a full redesign. The last designer quit. He smiled, leaning in slightly. "Well, from what I've seen so far, whoever quit made a big mistake." That night, for the first time in years, I laughed without forcing it. We ended up ordering takeout, talking for hours about everything from design trends to childhood dreams. He was smart, kind, funny, and completely out of my league. At least, that's what Linda would have said. Over the next few months, Daniel started showing up more often. At first it was under the excuse of checking on the project, but soon it became obvious he didn't need an excuse. He'd bring me coffee, ask about my weekend, send funny memes. And then one rainy Tuesday, as we stood outside the office waiting for our rides, he looked at me and said, "Emily, I've been wanting to ask you something. Would you like to get dinner with me sometime? I almost said no out of pure disbelief. But something in his eyes, something honest, made me say yes. That dinner changed everything. We talked for 5 hours straight. He told me about how he'd started his own real estate company from scratch after his dad's bankruptcy. I told him about my mom, about my art, about feeling invisible. He listened like no one ever had. When he dropped me home that night, he kissed my cheek and said, "You deserve the world, Emily. Don't ever let anyone tell you otherwise." I didn't know it then, but that sentence would become the seed of something much bigger, not just love, but healing. When our relationship became official, Linda found out through Facebook. I had posted a photo of us hiking, his arm around me, my face glowing in the sunlight. The comments were mostly sweet, except hers. She commented, "Well, look at you. Didn't know you were into real estate types now, winking face." It was harmless on the surface, but I knew that tone. That familiar condescension wrapped in faux support. A week later, I got a call from her. "So," she began, "I saw your little post. Daniel Hayes, huh? The developer?" "Yes," I said carefully. "Well, good for you," she continued, her voice sugar-coated but tight. "Just be realistic, honey. Men like that, they don't usually go for girls who still rent apartments and wear clearance shoes." That time I didn't cry. I just said, "We'll see, Aunt Linda," and hung up. A year later, Daniel proposed. It was quiet, intimate, just us, a lakeside cabin, and a ring hidden in my sketchbook. He said, "You once told me you felt invisible. I see you, Emily. Every part of you." I said yes through tears. When we announced our engagement, Linda called again, pretending to be happy, but I could hear the disbelief underneath every word. "Well, my goodness. Who would have thought? Daniel Hayes. You really surprised us all, sweetheart." I didn't invite her out of revenge. I didn't plan to. But my mother's younger brother, Uncle Mark, convinced me otherwise. "Family is family, Em," he said. "Don't lower yourself to her level." So I sent her an invitation, partly out of politeness, partly because I wanted her to see, with her own eyes, that she'd been wrong about me all along. What I didn't know then was that fate had a cruel sense of humor. 2 months before the wedding, the catering company we'd booked suddenly went bankrupt. We were desperate, calling every vendor in town. And that's when Daniel, not knowing the full family history, found Linda's business online. Her company specialized in luxury event service staffing. He called them himself, and she jumped at the opportunity. When he told me, my stomach dropped. "Wait, Linda Carter Events?" I asked. "Yeah," he said, looking confused. "You know her?" I forced a smile.
"Yeah."
"You could say that." I wanted to cancel, but Daniel insisted she came highly recommended and was offering a discount since it was family. So I said yes, and silently prepared myself for the most uncomfortable wedding imaginable. What happened that night, though, was something I never could have scripted. The night before my wedding, I couldn't sleep. My thoughts were tangled. Memories of my mother, flashes of Aunt Linda's smirk, Daniel's steady voice promising, "Tomorrow is your day." I lay in bed staring at the ceiling of the guest house Daniel had rented near the venue, feeling my heart thud against my ribs like it was keeping time for something huge. I wasn't nervous about marrying Daniel. I was nervous about everything else. About seeing Linda again after all those years of quiet, calculated condescension. About the inevitable moment when she'd realize she wasn't sitting at the head table. She'd be serving it. The morning came in a blur of soft light and chaos. Bridesmaids rushing, hair curlers hissing, makeup artists shouting for bobby pins. My best friend, Jess, was my maid of honor. She'd known me since high school, and she was the one person who could read my mind without words. When the photographer asked me to look into the mirror for a candid reflection shot, Jess caught my eye in the glass and whispered, "You okay?" I smiled faintly. Just surreal. Because of Linda? I hesitated. Because of everything. The last time she looked at me, she told me I'd never marry above my level. Now she's bringing the drinks. Jess chuckled softly. "Karma serves cold, huh?" I didn't answer. I wasn't sure if it was karma or just some strange twist of life, but I knew I needed to handle it gracefully. Mom always said, "Grace is louder than revenge, Em." But sometimes grace looks a lot like quiet victory. The ceremony was at a vineyard just outside Portland, surrounded by rolling hills and a sky painted in late summer gold. My dress wasn't some high-fashion designer piece. It was simple, lacy, delicate, something that felt like me. When the music started, I walked down the aisle to a sea of faces, but I saw only one, Daniel's. His eyes were bright, soft, steady. For the first time in years, I didn't feel invisible. We exchanged vows under a floral arch, and I swear I felt my mom there. In the wind, in the sunlight, in the way Daniel squeezed my hand when my voice cracked. When the officiant said, "You may kiss the bride," I heard a cheer ripple through the guests, but behind it, faintly, I thought I heard the clinking of glassware, the quiet rhythm of someone setting up champagne. Linda was there. Somewhere behind the curtain of celebration. She was working. It wasn't until the reception began that I saw her. The ballroom glowed under fairy lights, with tables dressed in white linen and gold accents. The smell of roasted garlic and vanilla cake floated through the air. Guests laughed, music swelled. Everything was perfect. Then I caught a glimpse of movement near the bar, and there she was. Aunt Linda. Her once blonde hair now streaked with gray, pinned tightly in a bun. Her crisp uniform, black vest, white shirt, bow tie, made her look smaller somehow. Older. She was arranging champagne flutes, her lips pressed tight. Our eyes met for the briefest moment. I saw recognition, then disbelief, then something that looked almost like panic. She froze, one hand midair holding a glass, as if she'd seen a ghost. I didn't say anything. I simply smiled, soft, polite, detached. The same smile she'd given me years ago when she'd told me I wasn't good enough. For a long second, she didn't move. Then she looked away and busied herself with the tray. Jess appeared beside me with a glass of wine and whispered, "You good?" I nodded, exhaling. Better than I thought. Linda stayed mostly in the background for the first hour, hovering near the catering staff, avoiding my side of the room. But I saw her eyes flick toward me every now and then, not with kindness or pride, but with the fragile disbelief of someone realizing they'd built their identity on a lie. Dinner passed beautifully. The toasts began, Jess gave a funny one, Daniel's brother got emotional, and then I stood to thank everyone. "I don't want to make this long," I began, holding Daniel's hand. "But I just want to say, I grew up thinking love had levels. That there were people who belonged in certain rooms and people who didn't. But today, looking around this room, I realized that love doesn't care about levels. It just finds you, right where you are." There was a soft hush, then applause. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Linda standing behind the bar, frozen, her eyes glassy. It wasn't gloating that I felt. It was release. The kind that comes after years of carrying someone else's opinion like a chain around your neck. After dinner, guests began to dance. I snuck away for a few minutes to catch my breath, stepping out onto the terrace. The night air was cool, filled with the sound of crickets and laughter drifting from inside. I was leaning against the railing when I heard a familiar voice behind me. "Emily." I turned. Linda stood there, holding her serving tray against her hip, eyes darting nervously toward the door. "Hi, Aunt Linda," I said softly. She swallowed hard. I didn't realize this was your wedding until I got here." I tilted my head. "Daniel mentioned hiring your company. I didn't know you'd be here personally. I don't usually. We're short-staffed tonight." Her voice trembled slightly. "Congratulations. It's beautiful." "Thank you," I said, and let the silence stretch. She shifted on her feet, glancing at the ring on my hand, the gown, the laughter spilling through the open door. "You've done well for yourself." The words were strained, like she had to drag them out through gritted teeth. I smiled faintly. "You once told me I'd never marry above my level." Her face flushed. "Emily, I used to believe you," I said quietly. "For years, I thought you were right. That I'd always be the girl who never quite measured up. But you were wrong, Aunt Linda. Not because I married Daniel, but because I learned that my level isn't something you decide for me. She opened her mouth, then closed it again. Her eyes glistened, but I couldn't tell if it was regret or embarrassment. You were young, she said finally, her voice almost pleading. I was just trying to make you see the world for what it is. No, I said gently. You were trying to make me smaller, so you could feel bigger. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The sound of laughter drifted out from inside, and a breeze tugged at the hem of my dress. Then I said, I hope you find your own peace, Aunt Linda. I really do. I turned to walk back inside, but she called after me softly. Emily. I looked back. Her voice cracked when she said, Your mother would be proud. And for the first time since I'd been a child, I believed her. I went back inside, rejoining the dance floor. Daniel pulled me into his arms, spinning me gently as the band played Can't Help Falling in Love. My heart was light, the tension dissolving with every step. But the night wasn't over, and fate wasn't done humbling my aunt just yet. Near the end of the evening, one of the catering staff tripped near the bar, spilling a tray of drinks. Guests gasped, and I turned instinctively. Linda rushed over to help, but as she did, a glass slipped from her hand and shattered. A murmur rippled through the room. She looked mortified. Before I could even move, Daniel crossed the room and crouched beside her, helping her pick up the glass. It's okay, ma'am, he said kindly. Don't worry about it. Accidents happen. Linda froze, realizing who she was kneeling in front of. Their eyes met for a split second. Then she whispered, I'm so sorry. He smiled, gentle but firm. No need. You've done a great job tonight. And that was the moment she broke. Not because anyone mocked her, not because she was publicly shamed, but because kindness, the very thing she'd never shown me, was what undid her pride. I watched from across the room, my chest tight, my eyes stinging. Jess slipped beside me and whispered, You okay? I nodded slowly.
Yeah.
Just full circle. When the last guests left and the lights dimmed, Linda approached me one final time. She looked tired, her mascara faintly smudged. Emily, she said softly, I don't expect forgiveness, but I want you to know. I was wrong.
About you.
About a lot of things. I smiled gently. I know. She hesitated, then added, You've built a beautiful life. Don't let bitterness take that from you. And for the first time in my life, Aunt Linda didn't sound superior. She sounded human. That night, as Daniel and I drove away with tin cans clattering behind the car and stars lighting up the highway, I looked out the window and thought of Mom. I could almost hear her voice. You don't have to fight people like Linda, honey. Just live better. And I did. Because sometimes revenge doesn't come as fire or fury. It comes as peace, as love, as the quiet satisfaction of knowing you rose higher than the ones who said you couldn't. The morning after the wedding felt like waking up from a dream I'd been waiting my whole life to have. I remember opening my eyes to sunlight spilling through white curtains, the smell of fresh coffee drifting in from the kitchen, and Daniel humming softly to himself. I lay there for a minute, my ring catching the light on my finger, my heart still raw and full from everything that had happened. And then, like a faint echo from another lifetime, I remembered Linda's face from the night before, the trembling hands, the quiet apology, the way her voice had cracked when she said my mother would be proud. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt lighter. For years, I'd carried the weight of her words, those 4 little sentences that had buried themselves in the back of my mind. You'll never marry above your level. Now they were gone. Daniel walked into the bedroom, holding 2 mugs. Morning, Mrs. Hayes, he said, grinning that boyish grin I loved so much. Morning, I said, sitting up. How does it feel being married to a woman who can't believe any of this is real? He handed me my coffee. Feels like I married someone who deserves every bit of it. We sat there, in quiet comfort for a moment. Outside, the vineyard shimmered under the late summer sun. Somewhere down the hall, the cleaning crew was packing up the remnants of the celebration, laughter, music, footprints on the dance floor. Then Daniel said, almost casually, "Hey, did you know one of the catering staff was related to you?" I froze.
Yeah.
My aunt. Long story. He looked surprised. Really? She seemed nervous when I talked to her. I thought maybe she just didn't like weddings. I smiled faintly. No, she just didn't like mine. Daniel raised an eyebrow, but he didn't press. That was one of the things I loved about him. He didn't need every detail to understand the emotion behind it. He just reached over, squeezed my hand, and said, "Whoever she is, she doesn't get to live rent-free in our future." I nodded. She doesn't anymore. Life after the wedding moved fast. Daniel and I settled into a new rhythm, a shared apartment overlooking the river, dinners that turned into laughter-filled messes, Sunday mornings that tasted like pancakes and quiet joy. I went back to work, but something in me had shifted. I no longer walked into the office trying to prove myself. I wasn't the nervous, self-doubting designer anymore. I was a woman who'd faced her past and come out stronger. When my boss offered me the lead position on a major campaign, I didn't hesitate. I said yes, and I meant it. But even as life bloomed around me, there were moments when the ghost of Linda's judgment would still whisper through my thoughts. Not loudly, not cruelly, just a faint residue of insecurity that hadn't fully washed away. And then, one chilly October morning, an email arrived that would reopen that old chapter, not painfully but unexpectedly. It was from Linda. Subject: "Congratulations and thank you. Hi, Emily. I hope this message finds you well. I've been meaning to reach out since the wedding, but I didn't know how. Seeing you that day, seeing what you've built, made me realize how wrong I've been, not just about you, but about what success really means. I've had a rough few months. Business hasn't been the same, and I think that's been a wake-up call. I wanted to apologize again for the things I said to you when you were younger. You didn't deserve that. You never did. Take care of yourself, and Daniel." Linda. I stared at the screen for a long time. There was no venom, no manipulation, just exhaustion and honesty. I didn't reply right away. I let it sit for a week, maybe two. Finally, one evening I wrote back. "Hi, Aunt Linda. Thank you for your message. I appreciate your apology, truly. What happened between us taught me a lot about strength, and I've moved past the pain. I wish you healing and peace. Take care, Emily." It wasn't forgiveness in the traditional sense. It was closure, calm, clean, final. Months passed. The holidays came and went. Life grew busy and warm. But one Sunday afternoon, I found myself driving past a small event hall downtown. A familiar sign caught my eye. Carter Events. Linda's business. Something made me park. Through the glass windows, I saw her. She was sitting at a table, papers spread around, glasses perched low on her nose. There were only two other people working with her, a far cry from the bustling staff she used to brag about. She looked older. Not just physically, but emotionally. There was a quietness about her that hadn't been there before, like life had finally taught her humility the hard way. For a brief second, I considered going inside, saying hello, offering help, even. But I didn't. Because some stories don't need another confrontation, they just need an ending. I smiled faintly, whispered, "Good luck," and drove away. A year after our wedding, Daniel surprised me with a framed photo for our anniversary. It was from that night, the two of us dancing under fairy lights. But what caught my attention wasn't us. It was the background. Behind the blur of champagne glasses and movement, you could just barely make out a figure in black and white, Linda, watching from near the bar. I stared at it for a long time, tracing her faint outline. Daniel saw my expression. "You okay?" I nodded slowly. "Yeah, it's just strange. She's part of this picture, part of the story, but she doesn't define it." He smiled. "Exactly. She's just background noise now." And he was right. That spring, something extraordinary happened, something that, in another time, I would have been too scared to even dream of. I got promoted to creative director. The same week, Daniel's company expanded into 2 new cities. We were building a life, not perfect, not glamorous, but ours. One evening, while celebrating over takeout sushi, Daniel asked, "Do you ever think about how far you've come? Like, if you could tell 26-year-old Emily anything, what would you say?" I thought about that for a while. Then I said, I'd tell her she's already enough. She doesn't have to prove her worth by who she dates, or what she earns, or how she's seen. She just has to believe she's already whole. He smiled. That's the woman I fell in love with. It's funny how the people who try to break you often end up building you instead, just not in the way they intended. Linda's cruelty had been the spark that forced me to find my backbone. Her judgment had pushed me toward independence. Her words had haunted me, until they didn't. I started mentoring young designers at my firm, especially women who, like me, came from ordinary backgrounds and carried quiet insecurities. I told them the same thing I once needed to hear. You don't need to be anyone else's version of worthy. And every time I said it, I felt like I was rewriting my own past a little more. One afternoon, almost 2 years later, I got a call from my uncle, Mark. "Emily," he said gently, "just wanted you to know, your Aunt Linda's retiring. She sold her business." I paused. "Oh, really?"
Yeah.
"She's moving down to Arizona. Said she's done with the whole status thing." He chuckled softly. "You know, she actually mentioned you. Said she's proud of you."
I didn't know what to say at first.
There was a small ache in my chest, not sadness, just a strange nostalgia. "Thanks for letting me know," I said quietly. After I hung up, I went for a walk along the river. The air smelled like rain and lilacs, the water glittering with sunlight. I thought about how life circles back, how people change, sometimes slowly, sometimes too late, but change all the same. And I thought about Mom. She used to tell me, "Your worth isn't something others can measure. It's something you wake up and decide for yourself." For the first time, I understood exactly what she meant. That night, I wrote one last email to Linda. Not because I needed to, but because I wanted to. "Hi, Aunt Linda. Uncle Mark mentioned you're retiring. I just wanted to wish you well. I hope Arizona brings you peace, sunshine, and everything you've been searching for. Take care, Emily." She replied a few days later. "Thank you, Emily. I don't know if I'll ever deserve your kindness, but I'm grateful for it. You turned out to be everything your mother said you would be, strong, kind, and graceful. I see that now. Love, Linda." I read it twice, then closed my laptop and looked out at the night sky. It wasn't revenge anymore. It wasn't even justice. It was peace, deep, honest peace. And in that moment, I realized something profound. The greatest revenge isn't watching someone fall. It's rising without needing them to notice. Peace, I learned, doesn't always come wrapped in joy. Sometimes it arrives quietly, like a soft snowfall that blankets everything you once thought you needed to hold on to. After Linda retired and moved to Arizona, her presence faded from my life almost completely. There were no more awkward family gatherings, no passive-aggressive comments, no ghostly echoes of judgment. Just stillness. And for a while, that stillness felt strange. Like the silence after storm. Daniel and I had been married for nearly 3 years by then. Life had found its rhythm. Morning coffees together, workdays spent chasing deadlines, evenings filled with music, takeout, and laughter. We were happy. Or, at least, we thought we were. But the thing about peace is that it has layers. Beneath the calm surface, there are always quiet questions, the kind you don't ask until you're brave enough to hear the answers. It started one evening in our kitchen. I was stirring pasta sauce, music playing faintly in the background, when Daniel came home looking distracted. "Tough day?" I asked, glancing up. He set his briefcase down and sighed. "Just a lot. Investors pulling out of one of the Seattle projects. Nothing we can't fix." I nodded. "Want to talk about it?" He shook his head. "Not tonight." We ate in near silence. Not angry silence, just the kind that sits between two people who love each other but are too tired to fill the space. Later that night, as I watched him work on his laptop, his face illuminated by the blue light of the screen, I realized something. We'd both become so focused on building our lives that we'd stopped living them. The next few months were a blur of deadlines and travel. Daniel was flying between cities for business. I was managing a design team that was growing faster than I could handle. Our conversations became shorter. Our dinners quieter. One night, Jess, my best friend, called and said, "You sound exhausted. When was the last time you did something for yourself?" I laughed weakly. "Define for myself." "You know what I mean," she said. "Something that isn't work or Daniel or keeping it all together." I thought about it and couldn't answer. That weekend, I decided to do something I hadn't done in years. I drove out to the old lakeside cabin Daniel had proposed at. Alone. The drive was long and quiet. Pine trees lined the road, and the air smelled of rain and earth. When I arrived, the cabin looked exactly the same. Weathered wood, wildflowers by the porch, the same creaky steps that sang under my feet. Inside, I made a fire, poured a glass of wine, and sat by the window, listening to the wind. And that's when it hit me, how much I'd changed. The girl who once cried in her car because her aunt told her she'd never be enough had become a woman so busy proving her worth that she'd forgotten to feel it. I'd won the battles, but I was still learning how to rest after the war. The next morning, I took out my old sketchbook, the one Daniel had hidden the ring in years ago, and started drawing. Not for clients, not for deadlines, just for me. I drew the lake, the trees, the reflection of light on water. My hand shook at first, but soon the lines flowed easily, like my heart had been waiting for permission to breathe again. When I was done, I flipped through the pages, sketches of my mom, little doodles from college, designs I'd long forgotten. At the back, I found something folded, a note from my mother. It was dated 2 weeks before she passed. "Emily, when the world tells you that you're too much or not enough, remember, those voices don't belong to you. Don't let them live in your head rent-free. Find your worth in how you love, how you create, and how you rise again and again." I cried, not out of sadness, but out of relief. Because somehow, she still knew exactly what to say. When I got home 2 days later, Daniel was waiting at the door. He looked worried but relieved. He said, pulling me into a hug. "You scared me. I didn't know where you were." "I needed to breathe," I said softly. "Not from you, just from everything." He pulled back, searching my face. "Are we okay?" I nodded.
Yeah.
"But I think we forgot how to be okay." That night, we sat on the couch, no distractions, no phones, and talked. Really talked.
About work.
About fears. About how success had become a treadmill we couldn't step off of. Daniel took my hand. "You know," he said, "when I fell in love with you, it wasn't because you were ambitious. It was because you were real. You laughed at the smallest things. You looked at the world like it was full of color. I don't ever want us to lose that." I smiled, tears threatening to spill. "Then let's find it again." Over the next few months, we made small changes. We turned off our phones after 8 p.m. We started taking weekend trips again, no emails, no agendas, just us. I began painting again, this time turning my sketches into full canvases. One of my coworkers saw them on Instagram and convinced me to submit to a local art show. I almost said no, that old fear creeping in again, but Daniel pushed me gently. "You've spent years designing for others. Maybe it's time to create for yourself." So I did. The night of the exhibit, I stood in a small Portland gallery, surrounded by strangers studying my work. The walls were filled with color, blues, golds, deep reds, but it was one piece that caught everyone's attention. It was titled Levels. A watercolor painting of a staircase rising through clouds, each step labeled with a word: pain,
Fear. Growth. Grace.
freedom. A woman stood at the top, faceless, but steady, holding a single glass of champagne. I didn't realize until later that the painting was really about Linda.
About me.
About every time I'd been told I wasn't enough. When the curator came over and asked about the meaning, I smiled and said, "It's about proving to yourself that you never needed permission to rise." After the show, I got invited to collaborate on a book cover for a local author, then another and another. Within a year, I had my own small studio. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. One afternoon, I got a package in the mail with no return label. Inside was a postcard, Arizona sunsets, pink and gold, and a short message. Emily, your cousin Sabrina showed me your art online. I saw levels. You found your piece. I'm glad. Love, Aunt Linda. I stared at it for a long time, then set it on my desk beside my paintbrushes. There was no bitterness left. Only gratitude, not for what she'd done, but for what she'd unknowingly helped me become. Time has a way of softening everything. By the time I turned 35, Daniel and I had built a life that wasn't perfect but was ours. He'd learned to slow down. I'd learned to open up. We didn't measure success by how others saw us anymore. One evening, as we sat watching the sunset from our porch, he said, "Remember your wedding day? How you looked at your aunt and didn't say a word?" I laughed. "Oh, I remember." He smiled. "That was the moment I knew you were stronger than anyone gave you credit for." I looked at him, at the life we'd built, and realized he was right. Not about strength, but about grace. Because strength is what gets you through pain. Grace is what lets you walk past it without looking back. Years later, when I tell people that story about Linda, the wedding, the insult, they always expect it to end with revenge. But it doesn't. It ends with forgiveness. Not the easy kind, but the quiet kind that grows in the soil of time and self-worth. Linda's words once defined me. Now they're just a chapter. One that taught me what no compliment ever could. That rising above someone doesn't mean standing on their failure. It means refusing to let their bitterness touch your peace. And as for Linda, she's still in Arizona, running a small antique shop now, from what I hear. Sometimes when I pass a vintage store here in Portland, I think of her. Not with anger, not even pity, just understanding. Because maybe she, too, was once told she'd never marry above her level. Maybe her cruelty was just her way of passing down pain she never learned to name. But that's the thing about cycles. Someone has to break them. And I did. There's a certain peace that comes in your 30s, not because life gets easier, but because you finally stop needing everyone to understand your story. By the time I turned 38, I'd stopped chasing approval altogether. I'd built my design studio into a small but thriving company. Daniel and I had moved into a craftsman-style home outside Portland, with ivy climbing the porch rails and morning light that poured through the kitchen windows like something holy. We didn't have kids, not by choice, not by fate, just by life. But we'd found other ways to nurture. Daniel mentored young architects fresh out of college. I took on design interns who reminded me of the girl I used to be, ambitious, anxious, hungry for validation. One of them was Alyssa. She was 22, smart, and painfully unsure of herself. The first day she joined my team, she showed up early, clutching a portfolio that looked like it had been handled by 100 nervous hands. "Don't worry," I told her with a smile. "Everyone's nervous on their first day." "I'm not nervous," she said, forcing a shaky laugh. "Just trying not to mess up." I recognized the fear instantly. It was the same fear I'd carried years ago. That constant whisper. What if they find out I don't belong here? Over the months, Alyssa grew more confident, her work blooming like spring after a long winter. But one afternoon, I found her crying in the supply room, hands shaking as she tried to pack up her things. "What happened?" I asked, kneeling beside her. She wiped her eyes. "I messed up the client presentation." I stuttered and lost my slides. The senior designer said, "Maybe I'm not cut out for this." Her words cracked something open in me, a soundless echo of my aunt's voice, decades old. "You'll never marry above your level, Emily. People like us stay where we belong." I took a breath, steady and slow. "Alyssa," I said, "look at me." She did, her eyes red and glassy. "You don't get to let one person's opinion define your worth," I told her. "You messed up, okay. But everyone messes up. What matters is what you do after. You don't get to quit before the story's even started." She sniffed. "Easy for you to say. You're you." I smiled softly. "I wasn't always. You'd be surprised how many times I've been told I wasn't enough." Her brow furrowed. "Really?" "Oh, yes," I said. "And one day, when you're standing where I am, you'll say the same to someone else." That's how this works. We break the cycle. That day, she didn't quit. And a few months later, she led her own project and nailed it. Watching her beam during that meeting, I realized something profound. Maybe the real revenge against cruelty isn't success. Maybe it's kindness, the kind that repairs what someone else once tried to break. Around that same time, I got a call from my cousin, Sabrina, Linda's daughter. "Hey, she said hesitantly. "I know we haven't talked in a while, but Mom isn't doing great." My stomach dropped. "What's wrong?" "She's fine physically," Sabrina said. "Just lonely. Business hasn't been good, and she's talking about selling the shop. She asked about you, actually." That surprised me. "She did?" "Yeah," she said softly. "She said she saw your latest interview, the one where you talked about your studio and mentorship." She was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said, "I guess I was wrong about Emily." I didn't know how to respond. For years, I'd thought I'd made peace with the past, but hearing those words stirred something complicated inside me. "Would you?" Sabrina hesitated. "Would you maybe call her? I think she misses you, even if she won't say it." I didn't answer right away. After we hung up, I sat on my porch, watching the sky melt from orange to blue. Part of me wanted to let it go,
To keep my peace.
but another part, the part that still believed people could change, whispered, "Maybe it's time." A week later, I dialed Linda's number. It rang twice before a faint, older voice answered. "Hello." "Hi, Aunt Linda," I said, my voice gentler than I expected. "It's Emily." There was a pause. "Emily," she repeated, as if testing the sound. "I wasn't sure you'd ever call." "I wasn't either," I admitted. "How are you?" She laughed, a small, brittle sound. "Well, I'm 81 and can't find my glasses half the time. Other than that, surviving." We both chuckled awkwardly, the silence between us soft but weighted. "I heard you've been doing well," she said finally. "Your art, your business. Sabrina shows me your pictures sometimes." "Thank you," I said quietly. Then she sighed. "You know, Emily, I've had a lot of time to think these last few years. About how I treated you. About the things I said." I held my breath. She continued, voice trembling. "I thought I was protecting you. I told myself the world was cruel, and I didn't want you to get hurt by dreaming too high. But I see now that I was the cruel one. And I'm sorry. I really am." The words came out slow, raw, and unpracticed, the kind of apology that costs a person years of silence. My throat tightened.
Thank you, I said.
"That means more than you know." "I don't expect forgiveness," she whispered. "But I wanted you to know. I was wrong. You did marry above your level, not because of money or status, but because you found someone who loves you right. And you became more than I ever imagined." I felt tears fill my eyes. "I forgave you a long time ago," I said softly. "I just didn't know if you needed to hear it."
"I did," she said.
"I really did." We talked for nearly an hour, about small things, old memories, people we'd both lost. And when we hung up, I didn't feel anger or triumph. I felt peace, the kind that comes when you finally close a door without slamming it. A few months later, Sabrina invited me to visit. I hesitated, but eventually agreed. When I arrived, Linda was sitting on her porch, wrapped in a blanket, a cup of tea trembling in her hands. She looked smaller than I remembered, not just older, but softer. Time had erased the sharpness that once defined her. "Emily," she said, smiling. "You came." I sat beside her. "Of course." For a while, we just watched the Arizona sunset, a vast canvas of pinks and golds bleeding into the desert horizon. "I used to think life was about proving people wrong," I said finally. "But I don't anymore. It's about proving to yourself that you can live right, even after they're wrong." She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening. "That's wisdom I wish I'd had." We didn't say much after that. We didn't need to. Sometimes forgiveness isn't a conversation. It's a quiet understanding shared between two people who finally stopped fighting ghosts. When I flew home that weekend, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, closure that didn't depend on victory. Linda passed away 2 years later. Sabrina called to tell me, and I sent flowers, sunflowers, her favorite. I didn't go to the funeral, but I lit a candle at home and whispered a simple prayer. May you rest lighter than you lived. Then I looked around my studio. The paintings, the laughter of interns working late, the scent of paint and coffee, and realized that, somehow, her story had woven itself into mine in a way I hadn't expected. Because even pain, when transformed, becomes part of the art. One evening, months after Linda's passing, Alyssa came into my office with news. Emily, she said, grinning, I got accepted into the design fellowship in New York. I jumped up and hugged her. Oh my God, Alyssa, that's incredible. She pulled back, eyes shining. I wouldn't have even applied if it weren't for you. You believed in me when I didn't. I smiled, heart full. That's what mentors do. They see the version of you that's waiting to be born. After she left, I stood by the window, watching the rain. Somewhere in that reflection, the older woman I'd become, I saw the scared girl I used to be. The one who thought her worth was measured by someone else's voice. And for the first time, I looked at her and said, You made it. That night I painted again. A new piece. A field of wildflowers under a gray sky. Bright, stubborn, unbothered by the storm above. In the center, a woman stood with her back turned, holding a single teacup. The title came to me easily. Above My Level. It wasn't about marriage or revenge or even success. It was about becoming. Because in the end, my aunt's prophecy came true in a way she could never have predicted. I did rise above my level. Not above hers, not above anyone else's. Above the version of me who once believed I wasn't enough. And that, I realized, was the only level worth climbing. Time is strange. You spend your 20s running, your 30s building, and then somewhere in your 40s you look around and realize, this is your life. It's quieter, but it's yours. By 47, I'd learned to love that quiet. Daniel and I had celebrated our 20th anniversary the month before. We didn't throw a big party. Instead, we drove up to Cannon Beach, stayed in a small inn by the sea, and spent 3 days walking barefoot on wet sand, letting the cold Oregon waves nip at our ankles. He was grayer now, his laugh lines deeper, but I loved him even more for it. We'd weathered storms that could have broken us, but somehow, each one only carved us into something softer, steadier. My art studio had grown beyond anything I'd planned. What started as a single rented room now filled a restored brick warehouse downtown. We employed a team of 10 designers, interns, illustrators, and even had a small scholarship fund for young women in art and design. It was Alyssa's idea, actually. She'd come back from New York after 3 years, her career blooming. One afternoon she said, You always believed in me, Emily. Let's do that for more girls like us.
So we did.
We called it the Grace Scholarship after my mother. Every year, it supported 3 young women from underrepresented communities pursuing creative fields. Watching them come in each fall, bright-eyed and nervous, was like watching versions of myself stepping through the door again and again, each one rewriting the story a little better. One morning, I got an email that made me sit back in my chair. Subject: Keynote Invitation, Northwest Women in Design Conference. They wanted me to deliver the closing speech. I stared at the screen for a long time.
Me?
A keynote speaker? It felt surreal. I could almost hear my aunt's voice, sharp as glass. You'll never marry above your level, Emily. But I smiled this time because that voice no longer hurt. It was just an echo, a story I'd outgrown. I replied yes. The conference was held that October in Seattle, a sprawling event filled with designers, artists, and students. The air buzzed with ambition and caffeine. Backstage, I adjusted the microphone headset, palms slightly damp. I'd given talks before, but this felt different. Bigger. Alyssa stood beside me, grinning. You're going to kill it, she said. I just hope I don't trip walking up there. I joked, but my voice trembled. The coordinator signaled. It was time. As I stepped onto the stage, applause rippled through the room, 1,000 faces, most of them women, looking up at me. I took a deep breath and began. Good evening, I said. My voice steadied as I spoke. When I was 23, someone told me I'd never marry above my level. A hush fell over the crowd. I believed them for a long time, I continued. Because that's what happens when someone you love plants doubt in you. You water it. You nurture it. You let it grow roots. I paused, scanning the audience. But life has a funny way of teaching you who you really are. You see, the people who try to shrink you are often the ones who never learn to grow themselves. They hand you their limitations like heirlooms, expecting you to keep them polished. There was a ripple of quiet laughter, the soft sound of recognition. I carried those words for years, I said. I let them define my choices, my confidence, my sense of belonging. But one day, I realized something. I could either keep living under someone else's ceiling or build my own house with a higher one. Applause broke out, small at first, then louder. I smiled. And I did. Not out of revenge, not to prove anyone wrong, but to prove to myself that I could live right, that I could love deeply, create boldly, and forgive freely. Because that's the only real level that matters. I took a breath, my throat thickening. And the woman who once told me those words, my aunt, she lived long enough to see me become the woman she said I couldn't be. Before she passed, she called me. And she said she was wrong. That I'd found love and strength she never understood. And in that moment, I realized forgiveness isn't about letting someone off the hook. It's about freeing yourself from holding it. The room was silent, a kind of stillness that only happens when every heart is listening. I ended with my mother's words, the same ones I'd found in that old sketchbook years ago. When the world tells you you're too much or not enough, remember, those voices don't belong to you. Don't let them live in your head rent-free. Find your worth in how you love, how you create, and how you rise again and again. When I finished, the crowd stood. The applause wasn't loud and chaotic. It was steady, rising like a heartbeat. As I walked off stage, tears stung my eyes. Alyssa hugged me tight. You did it, she whispered. You gave them what you gave me. And for the first time in years, I felt something deeper than pride. I felt peace, pure and weightless. That night, back in the hotel room, I sat by the window overlooking the city lights. My phone buzzed. It was Daniel. You were incredible, he said when I answered. You watched the stream? Of course. You think I'd miss that? He paused, voice warm. Your mom would be so proud of you, Em. I smiled. I think she was there in a way. Yeah, he said softly. She was. After we hung up, I stayed by the window a while longer, watching the reflection of the city on the glass. My own reflection beside it. Older now, but stronger. I thought of the girl who once cried in her car after hearing she'd never be enough. I wanted to reach back through time, take her face in my hands, and whisper, "You're going to be okay. More than okay." A few months later, I got a letter from one of our scholarship students, Naomi, who just finished her first year at art school. It read, "Dear Ms. Carter, I wanted to thank you for believing in me. I was scared to apply for the scholarship because people told me art wasn't a real career. But seeing your story inspired me. I've never met my mom, but when I watch your interviews or read about you, I imagine that's what she would have been like, strong, kind, and brave enough to build something beautiful out of pain. Thank you for showing me that I don't have to live at someone else's level. Love, Naomi." I cried reading it, not out of sadness, but out of the quiet, humbling realization that my story wasn't just mine anymore. It had become a lantern for others walking through their own darkness. Later that year, Daniel and I hosted a small celebration at the studio's 10th anniversary. Old employees came back, students shared stories, and laughter filled the air. Halfway through the evening, Alyssa clinked her glass and said, "I think we should toast the woman who started all this, our mentor, our friend, our guide." I laughed, shaking my head. "You're going to make me cry." "Good," she said. "You've made us all cry at least once." The room erupted in laughter. Alyssa continued, "You once told me that success is quiet. It's when you can look at your life and know you've done right by people. Emily, you've done more than that. You've changed lives. I stood there, surrounded by people who'd become family, and realized something powerful. Legacy isn't about fame or fortune. It's about the echoes of kindness you leave behind. And sometimes, those echoes start with the sound of someone telling you you'll never make it, and you deciding to prove them wrong with love instead of spite. After everyone left, I walked through the quiet studio. Paintings lined the walls, sketches hung by clips, the faint scent of turpentine lingering in the air. I stopped in front of one painting, Levels, the same one that had started it all. Underneath it, in small gold letters, was a plaque I'd added recently, dedicated to every woman who was ever told she wasn't enough. May you rise anyway. I touched the frame lightly and whispered, "Thank you, to the pain, to the lessons, to the woman I'd become." And in that moment, I realized that maybe we don't outgrow our wounds. We just learn to carry them differently. Lighter, wiser, with grace. When people ask me now if I ever think about my aunt, I say yes, but not with anger. I think of her every time I mentor a young woman, every time I tell someone they can. Because in her own, broken way, she was the beginning of my story, the friction that sparked the fire. And maybe that's the quiet mercy of life. It turns even cruelty into compost for growth. So yes, my aunt once said I'd never marry above my level. But what she didn't know was that my level was never about who I married. It was about who I became. And that's a story I'm proud to live every single day. When I turned 65, I finally understood what my mother meant when she said, "Peace isn't a place, it's a posture." I didn't truly know what she meant until the world slowed down, and I did too. Daniel and I had sold our big home years earlier, trading it for a cozy lake house in Washington. The mornings there were like watercolor, soft light spilling over calm water, fog curling low around the trees. Our days were simple: coffee on the porch, tending the garden, the occasional trip to visit Alyssa and her family. She had 2 daughters now, Grace and Hannah. Watching her raise them with such tenderness, it was like seeing the best parts of my mother reborn. My studio, Carter and Company, was now mostly run by Alyssa. I still painted sometimes, though my hands had slowed, and the lines weren't as sharp. But that was okay. I'd learned that art doesn't need to be perfect, it just needs to be honest. One autumn afternoon, I sat in the studio by the lake, sorting through old sketchbooks. The air smelled of cedar and rain. Outside, Daniel was fixing a loose fence plank, humming to himself. Inside, I turned the fragile pages of a journal I'd kept when I was 25, filled with lists, fears, hopes, and a lot of heartbreak. I found an old entry that made me smile. Maybe one day, someone will look at me and see more than potential. Maybe one day, I'll stop trying to prove my worth. I traced the words with my finger. I wanted to reach through time and tell that younger Emily, "You did. You found both." I leaned back in my chair, letting the late sunlight pour through the window, and realized something. Life had been good. Not perfect, but full. And that was more than enough. A few weeks later, I got a letter. It was from a woman named Claire, the daughter of one of my mother's old friends. I hadn't heard from her in decades. She wrote, "Dear Emily, I know this might be unexpected, but I wanted you to know that your Aunt Margaret passed away last week. I found her number in her old address book. She had been in a care home for the last few years, and in her final weeks, she often mentioned you. She asked that, if possible, I send you something she wanted you to have. Enclosed is a letter she wrote to you. With love, Claire." I sat very still. My aunt. After all these years. I opened the small envelope. Inside was a letter, the paper yellowed, the handwriting shaky but unmistakably hers. "Emily, if you're reading this, it means my time has finally run its course. I won't pretend that I was a good woman to you. I wasn't. I said things that cut deeper than I realized. And I carried envy like an illness I never tried to cure. When I told you that you'd never marry above your level, what I meant but couldn't say was that I never thought anyone could. Because I never did. I mistook your light for arrogance, your dreams for foolishness, because I didn't have the courage to dream for myself. I saw your wedding photos once, someone from town showed me. You looked so happy. And I saw the man beside you. The way he looked at you. I remember thinking, so, this is what I was wrong about. I hope you can forgive me, Emily. Not for me, but for you. Because you deserved love long before I ever believed you could have it. With what little grace I have left, Margaret. When I finished reading, I set the letter down, tears slipping silently down my cheeks. Not tears of anger or even relief, just something deeper. A closing of a wound that had been open for 40 years. I whispered softly, I forgive you. And I meant it. That night, I told Daniel about the letter. He took my hand. You've carried that weight a long time, he said. I guess I needed her to see me, I replied. Even after all these years.
She did, he said.
In the end, she did. We sat there in silence, listening to the soft creak of the dock and the gentle ripple of the water outside. For the first time in decades, I felt completely unburdened. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't a gift you give to someone who hurt you. It's a key that unlocks your own cage. The following spring, Alyssa convinced me to come speak at one last event, the 25th anniversary of the Grace Scholarship Fund. It felt poetic. Full circle. The event was held in the same auditorium where I'd once given that keynote speech years before. Only this time, I was older, slower, silver-haired, but filled with a quiet confidence that only time could teach. When I walked onto the stage, the audience rose. I smiled, waved, and said, Please sit. I'm too old for standing ovations. The room laughed, easing the moment. Then I began. When I was young, I thought success meant proving people wrong. I thought forgiveness meant pretending I wasn't hurt. But the truth is, success is when you can look at your life and see love everywhere you turn. And forgiveness is when you stop wishing the past had been different and start being grateful that it led you here. I looked at the front row, Alyssa, her daughters, and a dozen scholarship recipients who had built their own paths. I was once told I'd never marry above my level. But what I've learned is this: there are no levels in love. There are only hearts willing to rise together. Life will always have people who measure you by what they can see. But you must measure yourself by what you can give. The world doesn't need more perfection. It needs more grace. The crowd was quiet. Some wiped tears. And I, for the first time in years, felt like my mother was right there beside me, smiling. When the ceremony ended, a young woman approached me. She couldn't have been more than 20. She said softly, Miss Carter, your story saved me. My own family never believed in me either. But after I heard your speech last year, I applied for art school, and I got in. I smiled and took her hands. Then the world just gained another artist, I said. She laughed through her tears. I hope one day I can help others like you do. You already are, I told her. You just don't know it yet. That night, back at the lake house, I watched the sunset paint the sky in streaks of gold and rose. Daniel sat beside me, a blanket draped over his knees. He looked at me and said, You know, if your aunt could see this now. I chuckled softly. Maybe she can. We sat quietly, the air cool and still. Then I said, I used to think my life was shaped by what people said about me. But it was really shaped by how I chose to respond. Daniel smiled. You always chose grace. Not always, I said, but enough times to matter. The years that followed were gentle. Slow mornings, sketching with my grandnieces, writing letters to scholarship students, planting new flowers each spring. And every time I looked at the lake, I saw reflections, not of the girl who once felt small, but of the woman who learned that peace isn't loud. It doesn't need applause. It just needs truth. When I eventually passed, peacefully, in my sleep, they found a note on my desk. It was addressed to whoever finds this. It read, If you're reading this, it means my story has ended. But maybe yours is still being written. So here's what I've learned. Don't waste years trying to earn love that should have been freely given. Don't let the opinions of the broken define your wholeness. And when someone tells you you'll never rise above your level, smile. Because maybe, just maybe, you were never meant to climb theirs. You were meant to build your own. With love, Always, Emily Carter. And that's how the story ends. Not with revenge, not with bitterness, but with grace. The woman who was told she'd never rise above her level learned that love, art, and kindness are the highest levels of all. Because in the end, it was never about proving anyone wrong. It was about proving that forgiveness is the truest form of strength, and that the heart, when healed, always paints in brighter colors.